What's up everybody? Welcome back to Polygon Academy. My name is Tim, and today we're going to be taking a quick look at how I use this single trim sheet and material to create this entire environment kit inside of Unreal. And then using that exact same trim sheet, just by making a quick material variation inside of Substance Painter, I was able to quickly and efficiently produce these metallic vases. This entire set of art from start to finish, including sculpting the trim texture in ZBrush, was done in under 8 hours, so basically your typical work day. So this is a really quick and efficient way of building environment assets, and along with, say, tiling textures, vertex blending, I would say trim sheets are probably in the top 3 of an environment artist's or prop artist's toolkit that they would probably use to create most of their work on a daily basis. One thing I consistently see lacking from a lot of students or junior artist portfolios is them demonstrating they know how to use trim sheets and tiling materials or textures to efficiently create their environments. A lot of the time in art school, students tend to uniquely unwrap every single asset they're making, and like I just said, that can be quite inefficient, and in an actual game production environment, you're going to be expected to know these techniques to produce your modular kits or your structured pieces for an environment. And a lot of the time, especially with large like structural meshes or massive objects, you can't really get the texture resolution you need with a unique unwrap without really breaking the model apart and using multiple like 1 or 2K maps, and that just blows your memory budget right away. So on a lot of times on large meshes, using tiling textures and trim sheets is going to be the way to go in order to remain technically efficient and really demonstrate you know what you're doing, and hopefully that will help you get a job by showing that you know these essential techniques for environment and prop production. So in this quick tutorial, I'm going to show you some of the pros and cons of using trim textures. There's definitely a big upside, but there is also some drawbacks. We're also going to be going over some quick UV techniques that will allow you to get the most out of your trim textures or materials. And that will hopefully save you a lot of time when it comes to unwrapping and efficiently using these type of textures when creating your assets. Finally, at the end, I'm going to show you some awesome examples of assets that were created using trim sheets from either screenshots from games that I've played or examples on ArtStation that really blew my mind. And there's some examples that I will show you that are completely made using trim sheets that you'll never ever be able to guess. I thought they were completely unique unwraps, and it is just a mind-blowing example of what you can really accomplish with these techniques. Before we hop over the computer, make sure you're subscribed, because I'm going to be creating some tutorials covering those other 2 essential skills that I just mentioned: tiling textures and vertex blending. These are absolutely essential if you want to get to an industry-ready skill set that makes you really a lot more employable if you're just coming out of school or you're looking for your first game art job position. I'm also planning on creating a super in-depth environment art production course. This course is going to cover everything, going from the initial gray box level designer layout that you would be handed at working at a game studio, all the way to the final polished AAA quality end product. The plan is to take this way more in depth than my ArtStation Challenge series. There's going to be a strong focus on using trim sheets, tiling textures, vertex blending, things like decals and stuff like that to really give you the entire skill set that I use on a daily basis at a game studio. All right, so let's take a quick look at what I managed to create with this one simple trim texture. And if you're saying to yourself, what's a trim texture? Don't worry, I'm going to explain everything. It's really, really simple and easy to understand once you get the hang of it. And I think a lot of you will hopefully be able to use these skills to take your work to the next level. So here we are in Unreal. I've just brought all my assets into the example Paragon scene that I used to develop my lighting presets. And if you actually haven't downloaded those yet or you want to try them out, they're totally free. I'll put a link to them in the description below. You can just go to my Gumroad and grab them. And then use them to light your scenes, or create an example scene and quickly drop assets into it and test them out. But basically, so I've created this little I don't know, like Greek style little pantheon or ruins or whatever you would want to call it. If I fly around it, you can see there's a bunch of like detailed, ornate kind of carvings on things, and I've made this little roof piece here. And it's all just using the exact one texture. And then I took that texture and quickly modified it and used it to actually make these vases. So they have these kind of concrete cracks on them just because I simply switched the material in Substance Painter. But as a quick and dirty hack, it kind of works. And if I was on like a deadline for a project and I had to create a quick set of props, this would definitely be one way to go about doing it, is to repurpose things you've already created to get things done on time. And if you think about it, like in a game, most people aren't going to see these things like up super close, and they still do pretty much hold up, even up really close. But for the most part, you know, a character would be running around, the camera would be moving like this, and no one would even notice that it's the same kind of stuff, just reused. So if I fly around a little bit more, you can see everything, it really has a cohesive feel because it's using all the same patterns and designs, and it gives it like the feeling that everything was built at the same time, and it's a cohesive like architectural set. And it's a great way if you're creating a large modular kit to make your, you know, your city or your buildings feel as like one kind of cohesive space, just by using a couple trim sheets or tiling textures that all kind of match the same vibe. So I'm using the same design patterns across all these pieces because it helps with using like a shape language like that it makes it feel like, you know, the same builder in this ancient city went and created all this, you know, and all the designs are cohesive, and it creates this kind of like art style that where it's, you know, everything in the world feels like it belongs together. So let's take a look at the actual trim texture itself. If I hop over here to Substance Painter, this is all it is. Basically, this is a trim sheet or a trim texture. You've probably heard the term before. You probably even used them yourself in the past if you've been doing 3D environments or, you know, assets and stuff like that. But basically, a trim texture is a texture that tiles horizontally or sometimes vertically. Some people like to make their trims vertical. I like to really make mine horizontal for the most part. But basically, if I was to take geometry and map it to this and extend the UVs out, it would just basically repeat because this side here matches up with this side here all the way across the texture. So I created this in ZBrush by basically just taking a plane in Max and started slicing it up into various different strip widths. The more different widths you have on your texture, the more versatile it tends to be. And I actually created the texture first before I created any of this geometry. So just by kind of, you know, based on my experience of the different widths that tend to work on geometry, I just sliced this up. I knew I would want like a large, you know, stone block tiles, kind of some more ornate trims, maybe some, you know, individual square tiles, and then I could break this into use these two textures here as like a lip, or, you know, this band right here of metal, or the band of metal with the two stone pieces sticking out of it. So there's a whole bunch of ways to use this texture, or even just these thin stone strips I can map to an edge of something that's like kind of thinner to give it this illusion of bevel detail. And that's actually a really easy way to make things look a lot more high poly than they are, is to add that little beveled lip to your trim textures. If I open up the texture itself in Photoshop and bring that over here, you can see each of these trims, it has this bit of a bevel to it. And I took my entire sculpt and rendered to texture it to a plane rather than actual, you know, 3D geometry that matched the overall 3D shapes I had created in ZBrush. Simply because if you render it to a flat plane, you're not having to deal with any additional smoothing groups or anything like that are going to create weird gradients across your texture by compensating for the low poly geometry's normals. That's a whole other topic itself. It can get pretty complex and complicated, but basically I always bake my tiling textures to a flat plane because I want them to work on any surface, like you know, a curved, rounded surface, an angled surface, something that's, you know, twisted or something like that. And because it doesn't have crazy gradients going across all of these different faces, it makes it a lot more reusable. And at the same time, having these little lips on all of these trims makes it so when I map it to the geometry, if I go to right here, such as like this edge, you can see when the light hits it, it makes it look like almost like this entire edge was actually sculpted. But the geometry itself is super basic, as you'll see in a moment. But by lining up basically that edge of that polygon and those UVs to that very top of that bevel, and then using another one that has another bevel on this little strip here. So you can see this, basically this strip here is on this texture, or let me go to Substance Painter, is this bottom strip here. And we'll actually go through and quickly point out. So you can see, yeah, this metal strip is just this strip here, and then I use these ones with the separation down the center to give it a bit of breakup to make it look like it's, you know, kind of constructed out of multiple pieces of stone blocks and stuff like that. And then these bricks on these columns are literally just this. And I'll show you how I broke up the geometry and the UVs to make it look like you would probably usually use just a tiling brick texture, but I wanted to create all of this with just one material because I just wanted to save a lot of time and give you guys a really focused tutorial on just trim sheets. So you can see by chopping up your geometry and your UVs, you can actually get a lot of reuse out of it. This rounded shape, you see a lot of these kind of shapes, especially in like, say, like God of War, they have a lot of these round discs for some of their arenas and these really cool floor patterns. And if I was to say, take this entire mesh and uniquely unwrap it, even at like a 1024 or a 2K resolution, it's gonna look really blurry because this is a massive surface. And we'll kind of touch on texel density or texel resolution, but basically a lot of games, say a third-person game will go for about 512 pixels of texture density per meter. So if this thing is like, say, you know, like 10 meters, mapping that to a 2K texture just isn't gonna look good. It's gonna be super blurry. But by tiling a texture across it and wrapping all these different trims around it, you can keep your texture density really sharp. Like this is just a 2K map that I'm using, and like you can get up super close to it. And yeah, you can start to see seams if you get really close, but no game camera is ever getting that close to something. And you can see by making sure I have all these horizontal lines in my trim texture, I'm really easily able to give the illusion of all these natural cracks and seams between all these different types of trims. And it makes things really like look like they're carved into the stone. And it's just using the edges of my geometry and the horizontal and vertical lines that are inside of my texture. So this ring around here is literally actually just created. It looks like it's carved into the stone. This is just right now, this is those square tiles. And then for this flat surface here, I needed some kind of filler stuff. So I just mapped that face to right here on one of these blocks without making sure that the UVs didn't, you know, touch these edges to show that there's a weird line or something like that. So if I hop over to Max, we'll actually take a look at the geometry itself, and hopefully you'll get a better understanding of how I'm just wrapping and deforming this texture all around these objects. So here we are in Max. Basically, I always take a plane and just kind of assign my material to it so I can kind of just constantly see how it looks and, you know, think about slicing it up, and I can slice up the plane, detach faces, weld them together to create, you know, cubic shapes, stuff like that. But for this mesh, I literally just started with a cylinder and started just modeling some interesting shapes I thought would be kind of cool. If I turn on the wireframe here, I'll isolate the mesh. So like I said, I created the texture first just based on dimensions that I know are useful, sort of. Just really playing around with it, getting creative, and I knew that I would be able to adapt the texture to basically any geometry that I create by adding just extra edge loops or deforming the geometry slightly. So yeah, you can see that basically I have this here, all these faces here are mapped to those two blocks, and if I actually open up an unwrap window, the thing with trim textures is you're going to really have to lay out your geometry based on edge loops, and a lot of your UVs are going to be straightened into strips. And that way, even though the geometry is rounded and twisted, because the UVs are laid out into a flat strip, it's basically taking that texture and twisting it around onto the geometry. At first, if you've never done this before, it's a little bit of this mental disconnect because a lot of people tend to think that they need to uniquely unwrap their stuff, or they think, oh, it's round, so that those UVs need to be round. But you can, using your edge loops, you can slice them and then just flatten out all your UVs and you know, straighten things out. So if I show in here, make sure it's showing my texture, you can see that this strip here is basically this center ring here, and if I start to move my UVs around, you can see I can actually just quickly get even new designs if I wanted, you know, something like that. Just by sliding my my UVs around, I can actually come up with cool ideas on the fly. But in this case, I knew I wanted it mapped to those larger shapes to just kind of not have high frequency detail everywhere and have these like kind of like blocks that are kind of carved up in constructing this object. So yeah, if I go back to the UVs, Another thing a lot of students or beginners don't realize is your UVs can definitely extend outside of the 0 to 1 box here. So basically this space is often referred to as 0 to 1 UV space, and that's if you're uniquely unwrapping an object, all your UVs would go into this box. But if you're using tiling textures, you can totally just start scaling them up. So, you know, it starts to tile, and basically because the edges of the texture match up, it kind of loops around and creates this seamless texture that flows over your object. And I also want to mention that this technique is completely program agnostic. So it doesn't matter if you're using Max, Maya, Blender, Modo, whatever. This is a very common technique, and all you have to really think about is, all you have to know is how to use the UV tools in your chosen program. So it really doesn't matter what software you're using. This is a super common technique, and you know, I've used it in Maya, I've used it in Max, I've used it in you know, proprietary game engines, I've used it in Unreal. It's just, you know, a really common technique that people use to create their environment assets, especially, like I said, large structural meshes that you can get that texel density to be maintained by tiling the same texture across a mesh instead of trying to force everything into, you know, a 1 or 2K map, or thinking that you can just add 4K maps to everything, because a lot of the time on console you're not even allowed to use 4K maps because the memory budget is just not feasible to do that. So I'll just add an unwrap modifier to the entire mesh, and if I drag it over here, you can see this is what the UVs for this object look like. They're all just basically strips laid out over across various parts of detail wherever I would want it. So these faces here coincide with, if I go into element select, this piece here, if I wanted to change it to that, I can just, you know, move it up, scale down the UVs till the edges match up, and that would be, you know, a quick change that I could do if I wanted to change or play around with the designs of which trims go where. One of the kind of downsides of this technique is it tends to make your texel density a little inconsistent across your mesh. Like a lot of people, when you uniquely unwrap an object, you make sure that every UV shell, it has the same density of texture as the others around it. Because when you're using trim sheets, you tend to need to kind of scale things around to line up the edges, or, you know, scale it up, scale it down. Like if I go into my Unreal scene, you'll see that I've really scaled the UVs on this to get this design on the roof to be a lot larger, and it still holds up. It's like the roof of an object, you'll probably never really see it. But compared to where that texture is, it's a lot sharper down here because the UVs are, you know, scaled up a lot more, so a lot more of that texture is projected onto a smaller area. So your texture density does get a little bit inconsistent, but even at this resolution, there's nothing that really stands out as too crazy. Like if you start to go too drastic, you will notice, like, so say I took this one block and mapped the entire block to this column, yeah, it would start to get really pixely and it would just look bad. And just as you get more experience using this technique, you can kind of gauge what you can get away with. And a lot of people, you know, during production like to say, oh, we have this rule of, you know, 512 pixels per meter or 1024 pixels per meter if you're doing like a first-person shooter or something. But that gets broken all the time. You know, if you have to quickly optimize an environment where you have to start cutting unique textures and start quickly, you know, mapping, tiling and trim textures to things, you're gonna have that little bit of wiggle room to get things done on time. And, you know, it's totally fine to do. And during a game production, we do it all the time. And as long as nothing glaringly stands out, you can usually get away with it. So I find I have a lot of fun just creating different trim sheets and then getting really creative with my geometry. If suddenly there's too much of a blank space, oh, there's an opportunity to, you know, maybe slice up those faces, add in a couple edge loops, and add in a piece of ornate trim like I did right here. And it just is a really creative way of working, and it allows you to create things really efficiently, especially if you can get your UV techniques up to par, where you're like really able to unwrap things quickly and just strip map things. You can UV map this whole thing in about, you know, 5-10 minutes, right? Basically for this, you can see along the base, for this kind of beveled column piece here, it's literally these squares. I've just taken it and mapped them. I think it's right. It would be this piece here, and just mapped it all the way along. So if I move the UVs, you can see it's this one big chunk of consistent like UV island, and I can just let things kind of the shapes, the vertical lines flow across it, and it gives it that, it looks like it's constructed out of a bunch of blocks. Even though it's a more complex shape, I just strip map the entire UV island and put it anywhere I want on the texture, and it works nicely. So you could even, take it and just move it down, get some of that ornate detail there. If I wanted larger blocks and cracks, I could put it there, and then if I was careful and just lined it up with the bottom of those blocks, the bottom of that pillar would have a nice kind of beveled edge to it too. If I go into how I use these big bricks to kind of create almost a tiling texture, it's simply just by, there we go, adding some subdivisions to my mesh. And this would be another kind of a bit of a, sometimes considered a drawback, is sometimes you have to actually add a lot more edge loops and subdivisions to your mesh just to kind of control where you want the texture to go. So for the cylinder for this column, normally you would probably want to use like just a tiling texture of bricks or something like that. But in this case, I wanted to really constrain myself to using the one texture sheet, and I wanted the appearance of these large blocks that this column would be constructed out of, but I only have 2 of them on my texture sheet. So it's these 2 at the bottom here that I've kind of used, and the way that I went about doing that is if I had unselected, what I'll quickly show you exactly how I UV'd it. So I basically knew I wanted about 4 or 5 stacks of these bricks. So I took this cylinder, divided it a couple times. And then in my unwrap, I just did a quick cylindrical unwrap. Let's get a little tight in here with this multiple windows, but we'll get it done. All right. So yeah, I just used a quick cylindrical projection just to get it a seam down one of the edges, and then all of it wrapped around the entire texture. And then I just simply, break those UVs, move them down, break those, break those, break those, and then just stack them all on top of each other. Grab them, and basically I wanted to, because I wanted the 2 bricks to have that natural seam at the end, I wanted to make sure that the ends of the UV islands ended at the ends of the bricks. So I just, would scale them up. Make sure all the UV points are aligned here. And then I wanted to offset them, so there wasn't just a seam down the center of the thing. So basically what I would do is I would just grab all of these faces here, and then this one too. Make sure they're all selected. And then I literally just, shift the texture over till it's offset by half. And now it's a pretty seamless, like tiling brick look to the column. So just a quick little hack using breaking up the UVs and the mesh itself, and then just mapping basically forcing the texture to go where I want it to go, and really disconnecting my mind from, oh, this is a whole, singular piece. It needs to be one single UV island. Just starting to break up your mesh and divorce the idea of 3D geometry and 2D maps having to really match one-to-one, and start just thinking about almost like just stretching the map around your geometry. It's kind of hard to explain, but hopefully these little tricks have gotten you in the mindset of working with 2D maps beforehand and just customizing them, or customizing your geometry to work with those maps. I use this kind of technique all the time, and now that I'm showing this to you guys, if you weren't already aware of it, next time you're in a game, look at a lot of their like environmental structure meshes, and you'll start to see this all the time, where there's the little tiny seams in the corners that you can barely notice in games, but that's because if I add an unwrap to this, so you can see basically this whole curve is a UV strip, and this whole curve is a matching UV strip. I just flip the UVs on top of each other, and that's at along the bottom here. Just straightened out that curve, straightened out all the UVs, and made sure all the edges are straight up and down vertical. And that way I'm really just bending the texture to the geometry. And for the end caps here, in order to get it to kind of, seamlessly loop around, you just make sure that basically these inner edges and this inner edge are facing the same direction. So you can see on the UVs here, if I shift this around, I could make it seamless, or I could add this little, I added this little vertical seam here to make it look like it's kind of like two corners coming together. And it's just a little hack that you can use. But that's how you get those nice beveled edges around long stretches of geometry, is you use these thin little strips, the exact same stuff over and over and over and over. So once you can kind of get this way of working into your mind, it becomes really quick and easy because I can just model out shapes, add some subdivisions, quickly add some detail, and it looks really cohesive because it's all using the same stuff. And it's just a really quick and efficient way of building large modular kits with one or two textures, rather than individually unwrapping everything. Like if I had unwrapped everything in to be unique unwraps on this kit, there would be probably I don't know, maybe a couple 1024s for this, maybe a 1024 for the bottom, and then some texture for the center part, and then maybe model and sculpt a quarter of this object and uniquely unwrap that, and then uniquely unwrap this, like half of this wall, and duplicate it around. And same for this top piece, probably model a quarter of that, sculpt it up, and then have its own unique map. So you can see your texture maps and your texture memory would just start to skyrocket. But by doing it like this, it all works well together. And my texture usage is literally one material and 3 texture maps at 2K res. So it's super low and easy on memory, and it allows me to really quickly create all these assets. Like I said, I created all of these assets in the scene, including the texture itself, in under 8 hours. So like basically a full workday at work, just going and creating a trim texture, and then quickly creating this basic geometry, wrapping it around the trim texture, getting it in game, and you're done. So if you have a 50 modular pieces to make, this is a great way to go about doing it without wanting to blow your brains out and having to work a ton of overtime. So if we hop back over into Unreal here, you can see these bronze or gold vases that I created. Now that you've been looking at that trim texture for the course of this tutorial, you can probably spot it right away. So the X trim there, this is the square tiles here, and then I literally just took this one just with a quick vertical scale. It's pretty hacky, but it kind of works for some quick variation. So if we hop over here into Max, these literally took me less than 10 minutes each to create, because I had already been working with that trim sheet at that point, and I knew exactly how it would work, where I would want to place my details. All I did to make this is in Substance Painter, I took the same exact bake and just slapped another one of Jonas's gold smart materials on it. It's pretty hacky. If I was doing an actual metal set, I probably wouldn't have all these cracks in it and stuff, but I just wanted to give another quick example how you can reuse stuff a lot of the time, especially if you don't put a ton of unique, crazy details into your trims, and you leave them a bit more generic and allow them to get 80% of the detail on screen, the large forms, and then add unique props and stuff like that over the top of it. So yeah, these cracks and stuff, they don't really work for bronze or gold, but on a small object like this, it still is, it looks just like some kind of like ancient weathering or something like that, so it still looks okay. But yeah, if I go into the Max file, you can see exactly by now, your eyes can pick out where the seams are, right? So there's a seam over, or these two edge loops here are a seam. This is literally the same square tile. This is one of those thin little trim pieces right here, just mapped onto this geometry. The top is just this band right here. This loop here, if I go into Unreal, it actually looks like it has like a little bit of a bevel to it, even though the geometry is super razor sharp, just because that strip of the trim texture has a bevel in it itself, and that's this strip right here. Sometimes on your trim sheets, it's also really good to have a couple generic just bands without a lot of detail on them, because those strips will come in really handy in just a lot of like small edges and stuff like that. So it's sometimes, it's not really a waste to have these very simple bands of detail on your trim sheets. Yeah, so I mean, if you just toss this little collection of pots that are randomly scaled around, again, this taller one is just this one, literally just scaled up, this one right here. And you could create a little prefab out of that and adapt them around your environments, and you got a nice level of detail going right away with about 10-20 minutes worth of work. So super simple, a little bit hacky, but to be honest, this happens in game development all the time because a lot of the time there just isn't a whole lot of time to dedicate to creating little props and stuff like that, especially if you're either a world builder or an environment artist that's in charge of your entire scene. A lot of times I wouldn't have like 2 or 3 days dedicated to doing a unique sculpt for these props, but I would need to add something to my scene. So by getting creative with the textures I have, creating different materials and just UV mapping details onto things, instead of doing a unique high poly for everything, I can actually get away with quite a lot. And if I made a couple really cool, interesting actual metal trim textures, I could probably create a little asset collection and put this up on the Unreal Marketplace with less than a day's worth of work. So it's just a really efficient way of working too, because anyone that's doing, say, like an open world game, this technique is essential because your memory budget is so constrained because you're loading hundreds of objects for this open world, and a lot of the times you can't have massive 1024 or 2048 textures on everything. So basically I would probably be able to use a little 512 tiling trim sheet and create 10 or 20 different treasure variations, and that would totally hold up. Like this is on a monitor, I can barely see half this detail, and I certainly wouldn't be able to tell that it's like, oh, there's a little texture seam there, right? So even at like a 512 resolution, that would probably still hold up, and on consoles, it would almost definitely be running at that resolution anyways. So let's zoom out and take a look at this thing as a whole again. It looks pretty unique for just being one material, like I said. It's just creatively reusing where you can, and just knowing where to put your detail, having areas of high detail like these ornate trims with areas of like lower detail with these concrete blocks. And that's why just balancing your textures into different size trims is just so important. Instead of having everything be these intense strips of detail, it'll make your work look really noisy. So be sure to just add some more chilled out areas on your trim sheets, and that'll probably really help you cover larger surfaces. Like I said, like the center of this disc being mapped to this kind of chilled out section of the large block, or these stairs not having a crazy amount of detail on them because I was able to use those larger blocks, or these even the square tiles are kind of larger forms without all this crazy detail. So find that balance, and that's just developing your artistic eye over time. Because a lot of people, when they do like say a sci-fi trim sheet, they'll add panel lines and wires and stuff, like crazy detail all over the sheet. But then they'll zoom out when they've created a model, especially for props and stuff like that, and the entire thing is just too noisy and too busy. So it could be good to have like a couple just painted metal panels, maybe like one that's like a pipe or something like that with some fasteners, one that's like some hanging wires, and then some more kind of buttons and switches and stuff like that. And that way you can actually create all these like tech panels and props using just a trim sheet. So for this tutorial, I wanted to keep things really kind of like basic, a lot of basic shapes in here, just squares and bricks and stuff like that. But I want to show you guys a couple of really badass examples that I've come across that can really show you the power of trim textures and just how complex you can get with them. So if I hop over to ArtStation here, this guy, Cliff Schonel, sorry if I'm screwing your name up, I'm terrible with names, but he worked on God of War, and here are some really badass examples of trim sheets. So you can see it's all split up into the various trims here. Just super nice ornate details that he could quickly add to assets and stuff like that, to just really add some areas of high frequency detail and just really cool shapes without having to uniquely unwrap everything in the environment. And here's just another awesome one that's all these nice sculpted chunky details. And then he has a great presentation here of just some of these examples of these trims using that like framing technique that I showed you on that wall, where you map a trim around a square object or the corners of things. And it's this really cool like picture frame effect, or some ornate wood paneling or something like that. Another example, and the first time I saw this one, I had no idea it was 100% made from trims, and that is some of the vehicles in Destiny 2. So Ethan Shu, again, sorry if your name's getting messed up. This is super incredible. Like, it looks like a unique unwrap, baked from a high poly mesh. But if you look super carefully, you can start to see some of where the trims where they're used and reused, like this line here, these round pieces all around here, all this geometry, you know, mapping these edges here to probably unique different little parts on the trim sheet, wrapping trims around the gun, and all these panels and stuff like that is just, it looks super, super awesome. This is probably, you know, a horizontal trim wrapped around this geometry here. And once you start to look for it, you'll probably start to discover a lot more assets are made with trims than you would expect. Yeah, here again, you can see all these lines of these trims, you know, probably a trim down the center of this panel. I don't know exactly how he did it. This is just kind of like reverse engineering it just by looking at it, and maybe, you know, some trim work here. It just looks really incredible, and it looks like he had to get really creative with his UVs. But I think he even says in this post here that he, you know, the memory budget was super tight, so they couldn't have unique unwraps for everything. So he had to get really creative. All right, guys, so hopefully you can really see the value and benefit of using trim textures on your next scene. It'll save you a lot of time and hopefully some memory overhead. And it just gives you a different way of breaking down assets and thinking about creating things. This is an absolutely essential skill set to master if you want to get a job in a studio as either an environment artist, a prop artist, or a vehicle artist. There's just so many ways you can go about building assets using a very limited set of textures, and it's really important that you demonstrate you know how to use that. It can really give you a leg up on the competition. If you want to download the example meshes and textures that I used in creating this tutorial, I'm going to bundle them up and put them up on my Gumroad for about $5. Any and all proceeds will be going to getting a new current spec PC because my one that I'm using right now is really starting to chug after about 8 years of use and abuse. So rather than just putting like a donate link or something like that, like a lot of people do, I want to give you guys something of value. So you guys can go download my free lighting presets or these, and any of your support is greatly appreciated. And that way I can continue to create super high quality content for you guys. If you learned something in this video, smash that thumbs up button, subscribe if you're not already, and let me know in the comments below what you plan on creating with a trim sheet now that you've hopefully seen how powerful this technique is. As always, thank you for watching. See you in the next video.